welcome everyone. It's June 17th, 2020. Don Présent here with partner in crime, Serge Ravet, and a crowd of people who want to find out about blockchains and education research based on a report that came out just this week. We're honored to have Kerri Lemoie with us today to tell us all about it. Take it away, Kerri.
Hey everyone. May I share my screen? Will that work from here? Let's see, it does work. I'm gonna pull up some slides here, because slides. All right. So last November, I started doing research with the American Council on Education, who was piloting this initiative called the Education Blockchain Initiative, and it's funded by the Department of Education. And the Department of Ed, the Office of Technology, has been looking into blockchain and what could happen, how is blockchain being used, what kind of impacts could it have. And they started talking to folks last year, and they decided to start let's do a research, let's do some analysis and see what's going on out there. Hold on one second here. Okay, so I'm going to skip through the what is blockchain. These slides are made for to be reused, so most of you already here know what blockchain is. But super quickly, it is a decentralized ledger. It's electronic, and it was created to facilitate cryptocurrency. And it's really there's all these characteristics that are pretty critical that we can review real quick. But the common thing is that it's built upon the internet, so it's really just another layer of internet. Although it has a lot of implications, these different characteristics. For instance, we know that blockchains can be tamper proof and immutable, meaning you can put information on there and it can't be changed once it's there. And then there's a sense of permanence, which is as long as the blockchain is there, the data is there. And it's also peer-to-peer, which means that there's no central authority to approve any of the transactions that go on there. And because it was used for cryptocurrency originally, all of this was needed in a ledger. And then what has been seen over the years is how could this be used in other ways? And in fact, back in 2015, a group of us were looking at what would happen with badges if they were put on blockchain. And so that work has continued on, and there's been a lot of acceleration in the past couple of years in this context. So what I'm just going to do is sort of explain to you what we did for the research, what we learned, what we saw, and then also what are some of the challenges and considerations, and then next steps. Because the point of this research was really to inform a competition that is going to kick off, I think, later this summer, depending, we're just keeping an eye on everything that's going on, but it'll be a challenge for ecosystems being built using blockchain in some way. So what we did for the research is we interviewed about, I think, a little over 40 folks in institutions, implementers, so experts in education. We did literature review, and then we also did some online research. And folks like Simone were very helpful in letting us find all of this, what was going on out there. And then we went and investigated all of these. Oh, and in fact, later, there's a bunch of links in the Etherpad, but what I'm going to add to it is a list of the efforts that we found and the information, how we categorize them. So most of the initiatives and pilots are pilots, and they're in the planning stages. And although that's progressing quickly, many of them are really at the early stages, and they're thinking about what is going on with blockchain and how they can use it. So it's still very early in this space. So there were three main themes that we realized. One was the personal data agency and privacy. And this is a very positive thing that folks who are thinking about the space are actually thinking about how can people control their information, their own personal data. And what does it mean if an institution issues this information, who owns it? What is the difference between ownership and control? And how do privacy laws affect this? So this is a common conversation that is happening across the board with almost everybody. And the next one is my favorite, which I think is really kind of great for folks in open badges. This is what we've always talked about with open badges. And it turns out it's catching on, right? This concept of learning continuity, and that schooling doesn't stop when you finish school. that it continues on. People change careers throughout their lifetimes. And this is what sort of open badges was sort of created to promote. And I think we're seeing that catch on, which is pretty great too. And of course, like, let's consider that blockchain would support this because, you know, the permanence and the tamper proof, and it's there throughout a lifetime. So if, you know, say an institution goes away, you still have access to verifiable information about what you've done. And I'll explain that a little bit more. And the last part is the power of connected ecosystems. And this is what is going to inform, this is the part we're using the most for the competition and the challenge that's coming up. And I think this is also what we learned through badges, which was that issuing badges doesn't really matter if there's no way for them to be used, right? And power starts with ecosystems. And you start with an ecosystem that already understands each other. They already know what to expect. They understand what the information is about and what folks are doing. So being able to exchange that information is already necessarily happening. It doesn't matter what the technology is, right? The technology sort of supplements what's already going on in the ecosystems. And what we found was that some of the most successful efforts so far that are using blockchain are actually already based on existing ecosystems. All right, so we found about 6 types of efforts. The CVs, portfolios, and professional evaluations, digital credentials, which are mostly digital credentials. That's what we're mostly seeing. A lot of block search is going on. We have a few ecosystems. We have some pretty strong identity efforts, a couple of online education software efforts, and then also a few OER efforts, like peer review, and then libraries that are interested. Most of this stuff, the efforts we found, by the way, this is all international. We weren't just focused on the US, we were looking everywhere for what's going on. And most of the efforts are related right now to higher ed and workforce. And there's a couple that are bringing in high school. But that is just getting started. And then, like I said before, most of it is related to the issuing and the verification of digital credentials or work records of some kind. So this slide isn't quite representative of everything, but this is some of the technology that's underlying the efforts. Clearly, there's a lot of Bitcoin and Ethereum going on, but there's a large growth in use of Hyperledger. And then also the IMS standards, right? We have open badges as part of block certs, and we have the CLR, which is the, what does CLR stand for again? Comprehensive Learning Record. That is going on. And then we also have the verifiable credentials for education task force at the W3C. But there's other things going on too that I don't have in this slide. And I put a lot of it in the Etherpad for you to look at. And this includes things like the interoperable learning record work that's happening at the Chamber of Commerce, their T3 Innovation Network. And then there's the Europass work, which Simone might be able to tell us more about later if we have time. And then what I think is interesting is that mostly we've been looking at like the verification of credentials, and that's where a lot of the blockchain technology comes in and those standards. And that's what block certs does. Block certs is pretty much make sure that the badge is verifiable. Right? It doesn't really store the data on blockchain. It just says, hey, there's this hash of information. You can verify it because you can compare it to another hash of the correct data you have. Which is a little bit of a mouthful. Sorry about that. But what is being focused on more is the payload. Like what is the information inside the credential and how can that be understood? And that's pretty challenging because, you know, programming 101 means something at one place and it means in another place. They don't actually mean the same thing to everyone, but yet somehow we're trying to move these credentials around as though they do. So a lot of work is moving there. And I think that's the hardest part about all of this, where the technology of making credentials verifiable and is okay. Like it's not that hard to do that, but it's really hard to try and figure out what it all means to everybody. And that goes beyond the technology. And that's why also the ecosystems are important and sort of group work towards these efforts. Okay. So I'm going to go through a few examples from that we found. And when you read the report, you'll find many more examples, but these are a few that we're just going to highlight today. One is Workday, and Workday is doing some interesting work with their own digital wallet and digital credentials. And Workday already has enterprise software that companies use to hire. But now they're looking at how can they put credentials on a digital wallet, and these are all like, they have their own methods and verifiable credential, like standards-based data. And they're doing some pretty interesting work with opportunity at work and their STAR initiative, which is trying to find folks work who don't have degrees in the tech sector. And then Highland Credentials acquired Learning Machine, and Learning Machine created BlockCerts. And they are still shepherding the BlockCerts initiative. And the BlockCerts, for those who don't know, are open badges credentials that are being issued to blockchain. Like I had said before, they're verifiable because they're on a blockchain. That's how they do the verifiability versus on a web server, which is how open badges normally do it. And then the next two I'm going to tell you about are ecosystems. So Greenlight is software that is being used in the Dallas Community College District. And what they're doing is they're giving students complete control of their records all the way from high school into later internships, and they just started. So it's mostly high school and early college right now. What's great is that they are learner focused entirely. So the learners have total control over all of their records and who can see it. But they can also do things like apply for colleges and scholarships with the click of a few buttons. And what they're trying to do there is help students continue the college application process and actually finish it. If it's your first time going to college, your parents have never been to college before, you don't have experience with this, applying to colleges could be quite an experience, right? It's a lot of work to fill out a bunch of applications. And what can happen with this system is that it makes it easier for them, right? It gets them through that process a lot faster, and then they're more apt to get to college. I'm going to go back here and say one of the reasons why this is an ecosystem is because they are working throughout the Dallas Community College District. And I don't have the slide here, but I can find it for you. It's an amazing grouping of employers and community efforts and schools and colleges, and they're all really working together to make this work, and all of them understand the information, and primarily because they already understood the information, once again, before they had blockchain to help facilitate it. And this next ecosystem example is the Trusted Learner Network. So this one is interesting. They are doing something called reverse credit. And so what often happens is students go to community college, and then they transfer to higher ed. And sometimes they transfer to higher ed, like a university or college, before they actually get their associate's degree. But then sometimes they get into college, the four-year college, and they don't finish it. And then they're left with all of these like courses they've taken and actually no degree to show for it. So what happens in this reverse transfer program is that once they start earning the credits that would fulfill their associates, it gets transferred back to the community college system, which then gives them an associate's degree. So if they don't finish the 4-year, they at least get their associate's degree. So Arizona State University and Salesforce are working on this right now. This is a private system, so everyone who is involved in the system is on this private blockchain, and the students actually don't have any interaction. But this is the first way they are trying to use blockchain in this way to do something like this. Okay, so the next example is Evernym. Evernym is beginning to pilot student IDs in higher ed, and I believe they're hoping to have this live or pilots live by the end of this year. And so what they're trying to do is say, okay, we're going to give a student an ID. You already have student IDs, right? Students get them, they apply to universities, they get their ID, and then they can use that on campus. And sometimes you can off campus to buy books or get discounts to movies and things. And because they already have that process together, it's just one other step to say, okay, why don't we make it digital? And so that makes it easier for them to, and quicker for them to implement it, because they aren't creating new systems for this. They aren't creating new rules. It is part of an existing process. So that's a kind of a nice entryway, I think, for them to try out using digital identity. And this would be a self-sovereign based identity. Students would have their wallet, digital wallet on their phone, and it would have the ID, and then they could use it to the same way they would use their physical one. Ideally first on campus and then beyond that. including other websites and systems. And then this next example is called BitDegree. And so what they are doing is they're doing online education in a way that helps folks get jobs. So the employers are designing curriculum, and then students are signing up to take that curriculum and then take that course. And if they do well in that training, they potentially get hired for that job. And there's incentivization through a BitDegree type of coin that can be used on the system to pay for their courses. And then this last one is one of my favorites. This is not a credential-based one. This is just another identity-based one, but it is in libraries, and so it deserves another slide beyond just identity. Because what San Jose State University researchers are looking to do is apply an ID to library systems. Like, so if you get a library ID at California, you can go say use it in Washington or something like that. And they're thinking that there would be this universal resolver for IDs across, participating libraries. What I really like about library systems and why I'm actually doing this as part of my dissertation is that libraries are accessible in the community. And there's a very low barrier to entry to get a library ID. Right? Sometimes all you need is a mailing address. You don't even need a photo ID. So I'm really curious to see how they go with this. And I like to include it in the slides because it's not credential based. And there are other things going on in blockchain education, such as like peer review and open education resource publishing. But there's very little of that compared to credentials. But I would love to see more of that as people start to learn more about blockchain and how it works. Okay, and lastly, I just want to explain some of these challenges and considerations. I think we all pretty much know that blockchain is not some kind of like panacea, right? It's not going to solve everything. It's not going to make credentials better. It adds a layer of technology that is very useful. And 5 or 10 years from now, the technology probably will be very different. But this is what's going on now. So what's really great is that we have these education use cases that we can explore. And they may not exist in a few years, but we'll see. And these are some of the challenges and considerations that we're looking at and we should think about. One is one that we're all familiar in open badges, which is the underuse of digital credentials. There are millions of digital credentials, whether they're on blockchain or web servers or what have you, or they're not getting used. They just sit there, and so they're not very useful. And this is one of the reasons why we're suggesting an ecosystem approach. And the next part is that data ownership and control. There's a lot of confusion between ownership and control of data. People often will say, oh, well, students, they own their credentials. And there's a fine line there. And we want to say, yeah, sure, you own your credentials, but you don't. So even if you say, like, I am using a digital ID from higher ed, or I have a digital driver's license, the DMV that gives you that driver's license really owns that data, right? They can take it away from you. They can take away that. They can revoke that sort of credential. So there's a lot to think about there to figure out still. The third point is the digital divide. This is very US focused, but still 29% of Americans don't own smartphones and 46% of Americans don't own computers. They're working off of their phones. So that's a pretty big gap. And if we're going to start doing things digitally, we really need to consider how are we going to close that gap. And, maybe this is a way for us to really, in my opinion, get the internet to be some kind of utility instead of, something that only some people can have. It seems like we're all going to be needing it. We currently already do. The last bullet on this page is implementation costs. It's expensive to switch systems over. I mean, there's a reason why universities pick an LMS and then stay there forever. And they don't change because it is really expensive to move to something else. So it is something to consider when folks are looking at this. I get asked a lot, well, how much more is blockchain than any other kind of system? I don't think it is any more expensive or less expensive. I think it's probably pretty comparable. It's just that it's a switch. It's a big change. It's a change in thinking about how something works too. And then the last two I have here is that blockchain is still not widely understood or adopted. right? There's still a lot of ongoing development. The standards are being worked on. So we have a ways to go here. This is very, very early. I mentioned to someone the other day that I thought maybe this was like 1994 internet, right? Like we just haven't quite hit that place where there's like going to be mass adoption, because that system doesn't exist that's going to encourage people to use it yet. That will happen, but we're a ways away from that still. And then, the last thing I wanted to mention here, and I leave it last because I think it's very important, is that there's potentially dangerous implications for immutability and permanence. There's some reasons why data shouldn't be stored permanently, and we should consider that. We should potentially consider, what harm that could do to people. So a lot of folks are looking at that in terms of, well, how do you store information off chain and things like that? But it's something to consider as we build things out, that privacy is critical. Okay, and then lastly, before we jump into questions, I just want to put a slide in here about the Blockchain Innovation Challenge. You'll see in the Etherpad, there's a link where you can sign up for early interest. And this is what we're trying to do here is encourage pilots that will empower all learners, that will encourage learning continuity, and also improve economic mobility. I think also what should be on here and what will be stressed later on is the usage of standards. Right? Interoperability is pretty critical. And that's it. That's the end of my slides. Does anyone have any questions?
I'm back. Great, thanks a lot, Kerri. My fingers are very tired. That was a really good presentation. I encourage others to add your questions to the Etherpad. I've been taking a little time off and in some cases just adding some very typical questions. In other cases, I'm actually asking. There was discussion for things like verifiable identity at the IMS meeting in February. And I forget who was there. It was one of those educational blogger guys. And he was saying, bringing up another aspect of the digital divide, which is user awareness of how all this stuff works. And gosh, I lost my key. And so can you sort of speak to that a little bit in terms of how people are handling that? And
what's frustrating about that to me is I often will see these presentations where people say that doesn't matter, that the user interface will solve all of those problems. And I think that is a terrible approach. I mean, I think digital literacy is dangerous. Digital illiteracy is dangerous. But I also know there's some truth to this, sadly. The research shows that people just want to use things that are easy to use. And part of what the research I'll be doing this fall is I'm going to ask that question and see if that matters. For the most part, folks will use logins from Facebook and Google, or they'll use federated logins because it's really easy for them just to click a button and be somewhere. So I don't know that this is being addressed very well right now. I think folks think it's important that there's agency over data, that we have control over our data. I think that comes up a lot. And I think some folks are working on some technology approaches to that. I don't think it's good enough yet.
Great. And I think I know what the IPFS is, but I'm not sure everybody in the audience does. Can you just talk about that? Because where this comes up in conversations, a lot of people say, I'm going to put everything on the blockchain. And I just think that's going to be really expensive. So maybe if you can talk about content and how that content is tracked with the blockchain using IPFS?
Yes, I will. So IPFS stands for Interplanetary File System. And although we're not doing it yet, I think the report is actually going to go up there. So Interplanetary File System is a distributed file network. And what it means is that if I am hosting a file on my computer, I can give this ID to all of you on this call. And if you have IPFS, you can host that file too. So if I accidentally delete mine, it still exists. And there are folks in our system who are using this for evidence of digital credentials. So they're saying, well, let's put the evidence, like a photo file or what have you, or a video up on IPFS. And then if it's in a wallet and the owner has it, they can actually host the file from their wallet. And other folks who are using the same wallet system that has IPFS would also be hosting it too. So IPFS isn't like a Dropbox, right? You don't just upload a file to IPFS. It's more of a protocol where you are sharing the responsibility for hosting files.
So Napster for files.
Pretty much, yes. Kind of.
So question then, this is the classic pushback. How many of these ecosystem ideas, use cases, require blockchain tech per se versus others, ecosystem things that are out there, verifiable identity, signed, crypto, other crypto technologies? Where does blockchain come in, and how does it sort of take it to another level?
In a few ways. Right now, it's mostly issuing of digital credentials. That's the primary way. But there are some efforts that are starting to use smart contracts to trigger actions. I think those are the two primary ways. And quite a few of the efforts are not just blockchain, right? They're usually combined with some web stack of some sort.
Okay, great. And then another classic pushback. Who is it that Digiconomist runs this thing where he says how long it takes to do proof of work on Bitcoin, and how long it takes on Ethereum, and how many weeks that would power an American household, etc. So
Yeah.
some thoughts about the environmental costs, I guess, of running blockchain as a verifiable technology.
Some of the blockchains are terrible for the environment. Bitcoin is terrible. A lot of the efforts right now in education are using private systems. So they're on basically web servers. They're using like cloud servers. So they're not working in the same way that Bitcoin does.
Okay, so it's proof of, what is it, proof of ownership or something or other? That's that other way of doing it?
Yeah, it's different. With especially the Hyperledger systems, you can decide on private networks what your proof will be. And also in private networks, and also in consortium networks, which are slightly different but pretty close, you already know all the participating parties. So you don't really need the computational trust the way, say, block certs might on Bitcoin or Ethereum. So it's a little bit different.
Great.
I would say that right now it is not so expensive for education because they're not being really used that much, the public chains.
Great. Okay. So I think that's Simone. No, not Simone. It's Serge asking a question. Serge, maybe I don't totally understand it. Yeah, but maybe you want to ask it.
No, we're asking for blockchains. This was the question about clients, yes?
Oh, okay.
Clients, we're asking for blockchains. Are there institutions or individuals? Who's pushing for that?
Oh, institutions. Individuals don't know what is going on at all yet. There isn't enough going on that's really, the individuals are looking for it. We're hoping to do some research with individuals in the near future, but it is institutions that are pushing for this. It is primarily also right now coming from workforce, who is looking to...
Coming from workforce? Really?
Mm-hmm.
Oh, that was going to be a follow-up question. Okay.
Yeah.
So employers saying, do I know this thing is real?
Yeah, that's right.
Okay. Is the challenge international? That would be a question from Simone.
Yes, yes, it is international.
And what's not clear is the competitive advantage of blockchain over open badges. Could you develop that point? That's Serge again.
Yeah, well, first of all, open badges can be issued on blockchain, right? So they're not really competing against each other. Blockchain can be used for open badges. Right now, the way open badges are hosted are web servers. So the long-standing thing that we've all talked about is there's no historical reference on web servers, right? So if somebody updates a badge or it gets deleted, then it is only available where the student has it if it's in their backpack, but it's not verifiable any longer, and it may have changed. So what you have with something like block certs is that it makes it verifiable at that point in time when it was issued, because it can't be updated and because it is there for as long as that blockchain is there, that data. I don't know if that answers the question though.
Can I have a follow-up question on that? Can we say that if you, because I see that point, so I see that this is an added value for open badges, but if the issuer saves the badge in a blockchain-like log, so in a Merkle tree format, would it be a necessity that this is, because the thing that I think is overkill for blockchain is the fact that you need to have a global consensus on the state of that badge in that sense. And is that a real necessity for open badges, or is it an overkill?
I think it's overkill right now. I think block certs is an experiment. It was a way to try this out. I don't think it's necessary right now.
Because actually what we're trying to do with Bit of Trust, and I try to explain better in the badge summit, is to let that the log, the Merkle tree, just exist between the issuer and the recipient in the first place, and then further on, everybody who uses the badge or adds to it is adding to that data log, and it's not necessary to have a consensus outside of that log, which is, I think, more in line with the fact that people are creating now permissioned blockchains for doing the same thing.
I think that's a really interesting approach, and I'm really looking forward to seeing what you all come up with Bit of Trust.
Another thing, and that's a comment that I would like to make, not so much a question. So the thing that you presented on how data ownership and control is still an issue. What we're thinking of is that just to not look at a badge or a verifiable claim as being owned either by the issuer or the recipient, but as being owned by the tool. So really make that very visible and to the end user, very straightforward, that it's not owned by them, but also not owned by the issuer. That's a duality ownership.
Yeah, I'm intrigued by this. Some folks have been talking about co-ownership of data. So I think that is a way that other folks are looking at it too. You know, I think that right now we're seeing issuing of credentials on blockchain because it was just the first thing that's being done. So I don't think that's our long-term best solution for these things. I think it's just what folks are trying right now. And I think as the technologies develop and as the standards get better, we might see a change, right? I mean, I hope we will see a change.
I have another question I was going to follow up with. What was that? But if somebody else has a question, oh, sorry, it's just in my head. Never mind. Talk among yourself.
Simone, could we ask you to talk about Europass a little bit? Would you mind explaining what's going on with that?
Sure. And actually, I think I'm sure Barrett, may be able to add something to this. Is in fact, at the last EPIC conference with the tech track, we focused on really just looking at the EDCI, the Europass Digital Credential Infrastructure data model, and provide comments. So essentially, the European Commission has been working on a flagship initiative to revamp Europass, which was sort of an e-portfolio, a European e-portfolio intended as a collection of documents, including your CV, your diploma supplement, which is a version of a transcript, language passport, and 5 documents there. And so in this update, it's morphing into a full-fledged digital credential platform, which comes with a new standard, a new technical standard known as EDCI. That's going to be a major thing impacting Europe. And so, we've been trying to provide contribution, input as expert, and some of the experts belong to this community as well. I think the rollout of Europass was scheduled to be in May or beginning of June. I think, you know, it should be live yet. There is some piloting out there. But generally, EDCI has also been looked at, you know, across the pond as sort of one existing spec that needs to be considered in the wider ecosystem. As you know, when we talk about possibly, so EDCI works at the payload level, if you will, so less at the envelope or wrapper level, which is where verifiable credential is really acting at. And so, you know, some of the work that is happening conceptually within the ILR conversation is to say, you know, could a wrapper, you know, contain an EDCI payload? And as far as the blockchain angle is concerned, so Europass is not making any specific recommendation on, say, anchoring a credential to the blockchain because of GDPR concerns that were not really, you know, fully safe yet to make those kind of claims at that institutional level, right? I think the thinking there is more around using a distributed architecture, is around, can we have a registry of accredited issuers on a ledger, on the blockchain? And so that use case seems to have more tractions, particularly because in Europe there is already sort of an infrastructure of agencies that are quality assuring or that have registries of quality assured universities and institutions, and so that works well. But it's definitely something to watch for, particularly because it's just getting started, and it probably will have a lot of gravitas in Europe when it comes to, like, you know, those formal institutional projects. But, you know, this is EC sponsored. This is not funds handed over to a project to do something. This is the European Commission stepping in and doing this. There may be actually, and I'll stop with this comment, there is another part of the Commission that is working on the European blockchain service infrastructure that has a use case diploma, which is ideally working on the envelope layer. So the two arms of the Commission are working on projects that should converge, and, you know, we know that they were not really initially talking to each other, and so there is a bit of politics in there. But, you know, I'll stop here.
No, really?
But just quickly to say, I think you were a little frustrated in that the EDCI did not include open badges in this first implementation of it, right?
Yeah, that's correct. And it's an XML-based spec at this stage. So the Commission wasn't bold enough to go JSON and D for other, you know, either political reason. But as much as there has been a lot of advocacy, particularly also from you know, France and Alex from SURF, around just shipping the first version of EDCI as fully open badges compliant, and the work, you know, that I've also been doing, and the endorsement that this open badges had from Anthony Camilleri, who was the team leader in this. Apparently, the very first iteration does not have full compliance with open badges. What we know is that this is already in the works for release 2. So at this stage, what they say is that EDCI is a verifiable credential, you know, whatever that means, because that it's not really explained into that much many more details.
Kerri, I remembered the question I had for you, which was smart contracts. You mentioned that in passing. Can you talk about some of the use cases for smart contracts? Just an example or two.
Yeah, let me think of some. So smart contracts are basically tiny little programs, right? And they're decentralized. And so Ethereum and all the Hyperledger projects include them. And they're included in quite a few blockchain systems now. You know, one example of a smart contract, I don't like this example, but it's one example is a student takes an exam and they get a, you know, the score that passes, and then they're issued a credential for that. But it could also be, you know, a smart contract that measures an interaction between, say, like how many recommendations a person gets. So basically, smart contracts are just these little tiny programs that trigger based on information that are fed to them.
Oh, so it's almost like it could almost be like the learning record store thing where so many these conditions apply, so therefore this thing happens. It can be
That's
kind of
right.
like all right.
Yep. As long as the learning, as long as it's measurable in some way, as long as like a an algorithm or logic can understand those conditions.
Yeah, learning record store. What is that called? What's that technology called again?
XAPI? Is that what you're
XAPI.
thinking of?
Yeah, there we go.
Yeah, kind of. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay, great. Wow, this has been fascinating. Really amazing. You're doing it again next week, are you, at that summit?
I think we're doing a lighter version. I think I'm not sure exactly what we're doing, but I think we're going to focus on ecosystems and sort of do like more of a design workshop with folks rather than just present. Sort of get some participation on it. So I think it's the 24th at noon is where Sharon Liu and I are doing. Sharon Liu's from the Office of Technology at the Department of Ed.
24th at noon Central or Eastern?
Oh, noon Eastern, I believe. I should check with Noah on that, actually.
Yeah.
I'm
Believe it or
assuming
not,
Eastern.
believe it or not, for Noah, this is amazing. It is actually on his website.
Oh, what is?
The schedule is up.
Oh,
Julie, do you have the link for that?
Sure, I'll put it in there.
Central, but
yeah, normally he puts Central because he's
He
in
does?
Colorado.
Oh, because.
Yeah.
yes, he should specify that. Yeah, I think I saw it
See,
in the
you know
tweet.
what? See, this is the way I just assume things. I am assuming it's central.
I saw a tweet.
But it
with
is not.
Central. I saw a tweet with Central for some reason, but
Let me just send you this link here.
Well, yeah, because that's his time zone. Because he's in
Yeah,
Colorado.
if you want to put
Well,
it
no,
on
he's in
Etherpad.
Mountain Time, right? He's in
Oh,
Central
that's
Time.
right. That's right.
He's in Colorado.
Why would he
so.
do Central? Wow.
No, I can't. I think these are Eastern, but again, he probably should.
I should ask him. Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, if you want to.
Because it is starting 9 a.m. Anyway. Yeah.
All right.
So
Well, I'm doing a rehearsal today, so I'll ask and I'll put it back on here.
Oh, good. I'm glad to see so many folks on here are going to be doing things. That's
I
great.
feel like everybody on this
Yeah. Usual
Which is
suspects.
awesome. The usual suspects.
Yeah.
In
That's
the
right.
report where I talked about open badges, I was trying to be very specific to point out that this work is going on, that there's community work that is out in the open. And mentioned Aura in there because I want folks to understand that there's a lot of work that is going on outside of these standards organizations.
Great.
So,
Yeah.
Thanks for that.
That's
Checks
true.
in the mail.
Yeah.
Okay, so thank you very much, everyone. And if there aren't any other questions for Kerri, we'll wind this up within our 60-minute limit, which is exciting. And we'll reconvene next week, somewhere in the ether between Mountain and Central Time.
awesome. Thanks for having me on. Appreciate it.
Thank you,
Thanks.
Kerri.
Nice to
you,
see
Kerri.
everybody.
Great presentation.
Bye,
Bye-bye.
Good work.
See ya.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.